I'm going to take you through 10 additional terms that we strongly recommend you consider including in your employment contracts. The previous 10 in the previous video were more standard clauses. These are not your standard clauses. They don't appear in every employment contract, but they're definitely ones that we look at putting in if they're relevant. First one would be, first point I'd make is around intellectual property rights, especially if the role is going to involve the employee developing a lot of content or video content or written materials, research, things like that. And the next point I'd make is include clauses around restraint. So those are clauses covering, say, non-competitive clauses or non-solicitation clauses. So a clause preventing your employees from asking for a job with a client or a competitor, or even stealing a client if once they've finished up with you. Conditions around bonus and incentive payments. So you might have a bonus or incentive scheme in the business. I would definitely recommend you mentioning it in the employment contract, even if you mention that there may be a bonus or incentive scheme that the employee has access to. But I would never recommend actually putting the fine details of that scheme in the employment contract. Put that in a separate document, a separate agreement, and have them read that and sign that, just so that it's much easier if you need to change those conditions of that agreement and not have to change it in your employment contract and then have to have the whole legal employment contract re-signed. Another one I would put in is around dispute resolution, a dispute resolution clause. I'd also put in a requirement for an employee to agree to an independent medical examination if you, the employer, requests it. Also a requirement for an employee to cooperate and participate in any workplace investigations and disciplinary proceedings which they may be involved in. Another one is toil. So in your business, you may offer time off in lieu as opposed to paying your employees for overtime they've worked. So a bit like the previous one I was talking about, the conditions of the bonus incentive payment scheme. With this one, toil, I would also not put the fine details into the employment contract, put them into a separate time off in lieu, a separate toil agreement document, so that changes to it over time don't result in you having to change it in the employment contract and having the employment contract re-signed. A couple more. I would put your policy or your stance in there around personal use of mobile telephones during work time. We find this is a really big thing that niggles away at employers. So if you put it in black and white in there and have the employee sign off on it, that your policy is that maybe mobile phones are not allowed to be, personal mobile phones are not allowed to be answered in work time, maybe except for if it's in a case of emergency, and even saying in those cases they must notify you prior to bringing their personal phone onto the work floor. Times of the year annual leave is not to be taken is a really important one in some businesses. You might also have shutdown periods, so that's a bit like leave that must be taken at certain times. So it's important that you're letting the employees know in advance that those times, those periods do exist, and then closer to the time you give them the actual dates. The final one I mentioned is around cameras and tracking devices. So if you do have those tracking devices or cameras in use in the workplace or vehicles, you must let the employees know that they are there tracking and monitoring them. Final note, if you have casuals. Now, the casual space is very tricky at the moment, and there is lots being heard in the courts around casuals, and some casuals on the books, they look like casuals. Their contract says they're casuals, but there's nothing much casual about the nature of their employment. So it's a bit of a tricky area that you need to navigate. So there are a few things here. There's 3 things that I'll recommend always putting into a casual employment contract. I would definitely, number 1, acknowledge the 25% casual loading. Make sure that it's acknowledged in the contract. Secondly, I'd make sure that you include the casual loading percentages, and that's around confirming that the casual loading components are being paid as compensation of full-time equivalent entitlements. For example, 45% of the casual loading component is compensation for annual leave and leave loading entitlements, and then there's the 25%, which is casual loading component in compensation for personal or carers leave. Then there's a 15% component and another 15% component. So if you need to know what those are, you can contact us, or I'm sure that you can find it online. So the third and final one I mentioned around casuals is ensuring that the casual loading set-off is made clear. Make sure the wording around that is made very clear. Now, the list that I've gone through there is, and in a previous video around employment contracts, I went through some of the standard clauses, the standard terms that you should always put in your employment contracts. None of these lists are exhaustive. They're just the top 10 that I decided to choose to give you an insight into possibly that there is a lot to think about and a lot to know when it comes to developing your employment contracts. So if you don't have employment contracts now, or if you're unsure whether yours are still compliant at this stage, just contact us, find out how we can help you with these.